Okay, so I love proofs. It's one of my favorite units because it's very systematic, yet you get to do your your own thing as you solve proofs, okay? And so the first thing I'm going to do is kind of the setup of the proof. Almost all our proofs are going to look very similar, so the setup, if you know it, is going to be very easy. So the first thing you're going to do for a proof is you're going to draw two columns. Those two columns you're going to label statement and reason. You're going to number your statements and reasons. And then it's very important, it says that your statement and your reason, number one, is always going to be your given, and then your last statement is going to be your proof. And so let me show you what that looks like. So over here in this box, we're going to go ahead and draw a two-column table. On my left-hand side, I'm going to label this statement. On the right-hand side, I'm going to label this reason, because for every statement we make, we're going to have a reason as to why that is true. Now, almost all of the proofs are going to be 4 steps. So we're going to label 1, 2, 3, 4 on my statement. 1, 2, 3, and 4 on my reason side. Okay, and so they said our statement / reason number 1 is always going to be our given. So here our given is A is parallel to B and angle 3 is congruent to 7. So I would write exactly that in our statement. A is parallel to B and angle 3 is congruent to angle 7. Now, the reason that makes the statement true is the fact that it's given. And so our reason here would be given, because it's given. And then for our last statement is always going to be what we're trying to prove. So what does it say we want to prove here? Angle 5 is congruent to angle 9. Perfect, okay? And now this is going to vary, but at least you have 3 of your 8 parts of your proof already done, okay? Are there any questions about how we set it up? Where? Because right here it says the last statement is proof. So our last is number 4. Okay, so real quick, I want to go over our angles again just to make sure we know them. These are going to be the angles that we use to prove our proofs. So the first one we're going to look at is alternate interior. So alternate interior, an example of that would be this angle and this angle. What do we know about alternate interior angles? They're equal or they're congruent. Okay, so we'll be using congruent a lot for our proofs. Now, if we use alternate interior angles as our reason, then, as our statement, then we're going to, as our reason, have to put if 2 parallel lines are cut by a transversal, then alternate interior angles are congruent. Okay, so that's going to be our reason. And I know it says cute all the way down because somebody didn't check the spelling. So just scribble out that E so it says cut. Now, for alternate exterior, an example of that would be our 2 angles outside right here. We also know these are what? Equal or congruent. Okay, and so if we use alternate exterior, then we're going to have to put if two parallel lines are cut by a transversal, then alternate exterior angles are congruent. So that's going to be our reason if we use that. Next we have corresponding. So our corresponding angles are in the same place in reference to our parallel lines. Like both of these are above the parallel line and on the left-hand side of the transversal. We also know these are what? Equal or congruent. Okay, and same thing. Do y'all notice a pattern in this statement? What's the only thing that's changing? The type of the angle, okay? So all of these are true if two parallel lines are cut by a transversal, okay? So we're always going to use that part, and then depending on what type of angle it is, that's how it changes. Now our last one are vertical angles, and so those are across from each other, sharing a vertex. We know that these are also equal or congruent, okay? And this is the only one that's different. Vertical angles does not depend on two parallel lines, okay? It's just when two are crossing each other. And so we can write vertical angles or congruent, or for me, I will let you write VAT, because that means vertical angle theorem. So I'm going to let you shorthand that. Okay, so y'all ready to try a proof? Okay, so this one, they already drew your columns for you, and they already listed the statements. So we're just going to kind of follow the progression. So in number 1, A is parallel to B, and angle 1 is congruent to 3. How do we know that? It's what's given, okay? That is always going to be our first step. Our given is always our first step. Now, in the second one, it says that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. So angle 1 is right here. Angle 2 is right here. How do we know those are congruent? They're corresponding, okay? So this is how you can write this. I'll also let you shorthand this. If two parallel lines are cut by a transversal, so you can do the parallel line cut by a transversal instead of writing all that out, then corresponding angles are congruent, okay? I'm not going to make you write out that sentence until we get to paragraph proof, so I'm going to let you shorthand. Okay? Our next step says angle 3 is congruent to angle 4. So angle 3 is here, angle 4 is here. How do we know those are congruent? Because they're vertical. So what would we write as our reason? That. Okay? Remember, that one's different from corresponding alternate interior, alternate exterior. Okay, now, we have that angle 1, they told us angle 1 is congruent to angle 3. What else is angle 1 congruent to? Okay, what? Angle 2. Does everybody see right here where it says angle 1 is congruent to angle 2? Okay, so angle 1 is also congruent to angle 2. What is angle 3 also congruent to? Angle 4. Okay, so does that mean if I took this angle 2, could I substitute it in for 1 since they're the same? Okay, could I take angle 4 and substitute it in since they're the same? Okay, so if I substituted 2 in and I substituted 4 in, what two angles would be congruent? 2 and 4. Very good. So that is our prove right there, our last step. And so the way we did that was by substitution, because we substituted them back in. Does that make sense? Okay. I know it's new. We'll do another one. Okay? So in number 2, they don't have all the steps for us. We have to write them out. Now, what is always going to be our first step? Our given. So we want to write C is parallel to D, and angle 5 is congruent to angle 6. Okay? And what's our reason for that? Because it's the given. Perfect. What else can I go ahead and write? The proof. Okay, so we're proving angle 7 is congruent to angle 8. That's going to be our last statement. Angle 7 is congruent to angle 8. Okay, so in the, what we're going for here is looking at 5 and 7 and how they have a relationship, and then looking at 6 and 8 and seeing how they have a relationship. So 5 and 7 right here, what type of angles are these? Alternate interiors, so that means that they are what? Equal or congruent. So I'm going to put angle 5 is congruent to angle 7, and y'all said they're alternate interiors, so we put if 2 parallel lines are cut by a transversal, then alternate interior angles are congruent. Okay, second, we have 6 and 8. How are those related? They're vertical, so that means they're also equal. So 6 is congruent to angle 8. And so what would we write for that reason? That. Okay, now looking back up here, if I put 7 in for 5, because 7 and 5 are equal, and I put 8 in for 6, what 2 angles would be equal? 7 and 8. Is that our proof?
Yes.
Yes. So by what did we prove that? Substitution.
So would that always be the same?
For those type problems, yes. Okay. Do I have any questions so far about any of the steps? Okay. Let's look at one that's a little bit different. So number 3, we don't have 2 different figures. We only have 1. Is that going to change our first step? No. What is our first step always? The given. Okay, so we're going to write A is parallel to B, and angle 8 is congruent to angle 9. And what's our reason?
Given.
It's given. Okay, and what can we write last?
The angle 4 is congruent to angle 11.
Yes, the proof. Angle 4 is congruent to angle 11. Okay, so we're looking at 8 and 4, 9 and 11. Can you tell me which one of those are my transversals?
4 and 11.
Okay, we don't have numbers as our transversals. Which of the lines are our transversals?
A and an L.
Okay, so it tells me that A and B are parallel. Are our parallel lines our transversals? No, so it's not A and B, it's what? The other 2 lines. So this would be a transversal, and this would be a transversal. Okay, so what's the rule about hopping from transversal to transversal? Okay, you can only do one at a time. We can't hop from one to the other. So in the first transversal, we're looking at angle 8 and angle 4, because those are the 2 that were given. How do 8 and 4 have a relationship? alternate exterior. So angle 8 is congruent to angle 4 because if two parallel lines are cut by a transversal, then alternate exterior angles are congruent. Okay? Now we're looking at the opposite transversal, and we're looking at 9 and 11 because those are the other two angles. So how are 9 and 11 related? They're corresponding. So angle 9 is congruent to angle 11. Okay, and so that reason is if two parallel lines are cut by a transversal, then what? Corresponding angles are congruent. Good. Okay, now, for the last step, can we plug 4 in for 8? Yes, because they're equal. Can I plug 11 in for 9? Okay, so that means that 4 is congruent to 11, and we did what? Substitution. Okay, how do y'all feel about this? Good? Okay, let's look at our second note sheets. These are a little bit different, but they're not any harder. The last class actually said they liked these better. Okay? Now, these are going to be set up exactly the same way. We need to draw our two columns. We want to have statement on the left-hand side and reason on the right-hand side. What is our first step every time? The given. So it's going to be A is parallel to B and C is parallel to D. And what's the reason for that? It's given. Okay, and then we can go ahead and do 2 on both of them, 3 on both of them, and 4 on both of them. Okay, and 4 would be what? Angle 7 is congruent to angle 11. Okay, now this one's different because our given is that A is parallel to B and C is parallel to D. What I love about that is it means that every line is parallel and every line can be a transversal, which means I can work along this line, I can work along this line, I can work along this line, and I can work along this line. So almost every single thing is going to have a relationship because I can go right or left or up or down. The only thing is that in the very middle of these transversals, there is this lake, okay? And so this lake right here is filled full of alligators, okay? And so we cannot try to go across this lake. We can go around, but you cannot go through the middle because you'll be eaten by all the alligators, okay? So every time you start your proof, I want you to go ahead and draw your lake with your alligators so you don't forget that you cannot cross that lake. So, now, what I mean by cross, 7 to 11, what would I have to do to get from 7 to 11? Cross the lake, and then you get eaten. What about 10 to 6? Okay, I'm going to get eaten. But can I go from 7 to 6? Yes, because it's around. Okay, just making sure we understand. All right, so the two angles that they gave us up there, what were the two angles we're talking about in number 1? 7 and 11. So the first thing that I want to do is circle 7, and I want to circle 11. So I'm trying to find my path around the lake from 7 to 11, or I can go 11 to 7 using those angle relationships that we know. Okay? So does anybody have an idea of an angle that has a relationship with 7 that may also have a relationship with 5? Isabel?
7 and 5.
Okay, so 7, if we went from 7 to 5, those are corresponding. So that means that angle 7 is congruent to angle 5. And that's because if two parallel lines are cut by a transversal, then corresponding angles are congruent. Okay, who else had their hand up? Okay, Ryan, were you going to say 7 to 5?
Let's say 9 and 11.
9 and 11. What type of angles are those?
Those are corresponding.
Those are corresponding. So we could have gone 11 to 9 as well. Ellie?
It's 7 and 15 corresponding.
7 and 15 would be corresponding. So do y'all see that there's lots of different ways to get there? Okay, there's lots of different paths, which is why so many people love this unit, is because whatever makes the most sense to you, that's what you can do. I went with Isabel's because she was the first one that raised her hand, but we could have gone Ryan's way or Ellie's way. There's lots of paths. Now, how would I get from 5 to 11? I think you told me, but I didn't hear it. It's alternate interiors. So from 5 to 11, angle 5 is congruent to angle 11 because they're alternate interiors. So if two parallel lines are cut by a transversal, then alternate interior angles are congruent. Okay, and so this one is the only one where the reason is going to be different. Okay, so we found that angle 7 was congruent to angle 5, and then angle 5 was congruent to what? Angle 11. So doesn't that mean that that congruency transfers over from 7 to 11? It makes those congruent? Okay, so if it transfers over, which happens with 3 angles, so you see we have 1, 2, 3 versus the 4 on the other, that is called transitivity. I know, the other class that I was making that up. It's a real word. So that's called transitivity. Okay, so let's try another one of those to see if we are getting what we're doing. So let's look at number 2. What's the first thing that I want to do? Draw my 2 columns. Label it statement and reason. How many steps am I going to have? 4. So I can go ahead and do 1, 2, 3, and 4 in my statement and reason column. What is going to be my first step?
Given.
My given. So A is parallel to B, and C is parallel to D. And what's the reason for that?
Given.
It's given. Okay. And then what would I write down here in my 4 spot? Angle 6 is congruent to angle 16. Okay, so what do I need to go ahead and draw in my parallel lines? Your lake, okay? So remember, we have this lake in the middle, and it is full of alligators. So we cannot cross through there. Can y'all tell I like art way too much? Okay. So the two angles that we're trying to find a relationship to is 6 and 16. So I'm going to go up here and circle 6 and 16. So I'm either starting with 6 or 16. I can't use some random angles. It tells me I need to start with 6 or 16. So raise your hand. Who wants to tell me their path? Layla? So you're going to go from 6 to 10 because they're corresponding. So that means 6 is congruent to 10 because if two parallel lines are cut by a transversal, then corresponding angles are congruent. Okay, was anybody going to take a different path? Emma, what were you going to do?
I was going to say 3 and 6.
3 and 6. Yes, 3 and 6. That would be perfect. What about you, Ryan?
3 and 16. They're corresponding.
3 and 16. Very good. Matthew?
I got 6 and 11.
6 and 11. Yes, all of those would work. Okay, I love it. I love the differences. Okay? Now, if we went from 6 to 10, now we want to go directly from 10 to 16. So what relationship does 10 and 16 have? Corresponding. So we have angle 10 is congruent to angle 16 also because if two parallel lines are cut by a transversal, then corresponding angles are congruent. Okay, and so we have that angle 6 was congruent to angle 10, and angle 10 was congruent to angle 16. So the congruence transfers from 6 to 16, and so what would that reason be?
Transitivity.
Transitivity. Okay. How do we feel about those? Do you like them better or worse than the other ones? Okay, we're going to do one more of these just to make sure we got it. Okay, so let's look at 3. So the very first thing that I want to do is draw my two columns. The left-hand side is going to be statement. The right-hand side is going to be reason. We have how many steps? 4. So I'm going to label those. What is my very first step, Sophie? The given. So I'm going to write A is parallel to B, and C is parallel to D, and that's because it's given. Okay, and then step 4, Rachel Mal, what would I put there? My proof. So angle 1 is congruent to angle 13. Okay, Haley, what do I need to draw? Okay, I need to draw my lake, so I make sure that I don't cross this pond. I got to fill it with my alligators. Those green things, they're alligators. Okay, so the two angles that we're looking at is angle 1 and angle 13. So I'm going to circle angle 1 and angle 13. That is the angle. I have to start with one of those, okay? So who wants to tell me their path? Haley? So you're going to go angle 1 to angle 9, okay, because those are corresponding. So angle 1 is congruent to angle 9, because if two parallel lines are cut by a transversal, then corresponding angles are congruent. Okay, did anybody have a different path? Nick, what were you going to do? Angle 1 and angle 15. Okay, what relationship? Perfect, alternate exterior. Walker, did you have something different? Okay, Nick? Angle... You got to start with 1 or 13. We can't start with 9. So you'd have to start with 1 or 13. Okay, so from there, we're going to go from, did you have a different one? What would you do, Hunter?
Angle 13 to angle 9.
Yes, you could do that too. Okay, so from here, we're going to go from 9 to 13. So what's the relationship from 9 to 13? Alternate exterior. So angle 9 is congruent to angle 13 because if two parallel lines are cut by a transversal, then alternate exterior angles are congruent. And last, since we have 1 to 9 and 9 to 13, how would we prove that? Transitivity.